Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Eidolon hunting video. Today's video is going to be going over Limbo. I've had a lot of requests to go over Limbo for the Eidolon hunts, and I've delayed doing it just because Limbo is kind of a pain to use during the Eidolon hunt. And I think the best thing I can say for Limbo is that he technically works, but for a Warframe to make you immune during the energy spike phase, I would much prefer either Oberon or Harrow. Limbo just has too many limitations that come along with his kit, and he's definitely more difficult to play for the Eidolon hunts. His main limitations are that you can't damage the Eidolon with weapons or Warframes while he's in the Cataclysm, which means that your DPS player won't be able to build combo while the Eidolon is down, and you'll need to deactivate the Cataclysm to let your DPS player shoot the limbs. This just means you're going to be focusing on managing your 4 more often than a frame like Harrow, where you can simply cast it once and then forget about it. Also, when the energy spike goes out, you need to wait for all the waves to disappear before deactivating your Cataclysm. If you deactivate your Cataclysm while the energy spike wave animation is still playing, you and your teammates will take damage in addition to being affected by the magnetic procs. The way this works currently leads me to believe this is some kind of bug, but it's not a bug that I see DE fixing in the foreseeable future. And meanwhile, it makes Limbo more difficult to play for the Eidolon hunt. And if you're playing Limbo over a frame like Harrow or Oberon, you're going to be losing the extra damage that those frames can provide, meaning it's going to be more difficult for your DPS player to one-shot the Eidolon's limbs. But it's because of these drawbacks that I really can't recommend Limbo as a quote-unquote meta frame. But if you do want to play Limbo for the hunts, I'm going to be going over how his abilities work and how they can be beneficial to you during the Eidolons. I just wanted to be clear about the expected value from Limbo before I went into how he works. So the two main abilities we're going to be using on Limbo are his Cataclysm and his Stasis. So let's start with Cataclysm. When you activate Limbo's Cataclysm, he creates a rift bubble that shrinks over time. While inside the bubble, both players and enemies will be in the rift plane. The rift plane is unique to Limbo. While inside the rift plane, players can only damage enemies that are also inside the rift plane, and vice versa. This means that casting Cataclysm is a great way to avoid damage, which is what we're using Limbo for here. And I'm hoping that if you're watching this video, you at least have a working knowledge of how the rift plane works, because I'm not going to be going into it fully here. I do have an older video that goes over Limbo and how he works in more detail, which I'll link to above, in case you have any questions or there's something I didn't cover here. But basically, while you're inside the plane, you're not going to be taking energy spike damage, and that's all we care about for this. The size of Limbo's Cataclysm is based on your ability range, and the duration is based on your ability duration. Ability duration here is important because the longer your duration is, the slower the bubble shrinks. So by having a higher duration on this build, we're going to be able to maintain our bubble size and keep it consistent. This is important because we want all of our teammates to be inside the Cataclysm to avoid the energy spike. And if it shrinks too quickly, some of them could end up outside of the rift plane, meaning they would take damage and lose all of their energy. However, there's a disadvantage to having a long duration, and that is that you need to manually cancel Cataclysm with Limbo. To cancel the Cataclysm, you simply need to press the button again, but to do this, you need to be inside your Warframe. This means you're going to lose some charging time for Void Strike. Also, during my test run, I had a harder time picking up Wisps as well as proccing Virtuous Shadow on the Eidolon itself. But that was probably partially due to my inexperience with the Warframe. It's just something to look out for. As for power strength here, it's going to be irrelevant to this build. The second ability I want to go over is Stasis. When you have Stasis activated, any enemies within the rift plane are going to be frozen. This is a very good ability for general gameplay, because it allows you to freeze enemies. But for the Eidolon hunt, we're only going to be using it to freeze the Vombalists. This is both a good and a bad thing, because it allows us to freeze the Vombalists and stop them from healing the Eidolon at the last phase. But it also stops the Vombalists at the edge of the rift plane, which can make it harder to charge the lures. And if you're playing Limbo, you need to be paying attention to how many lures you have charged, and maybe deactivate Stasis if there aren't enough. And the benefit you get from the Vombalists not healing the Eidolon is marginal. If you have a halfway decent DPS player, killing the Eidolon should not be an issue. And remember, because the other two Warframe options give you a damage boost, preventing the Eidolon from healing itself really isn't that great, but it is something that Limbo can do. The third ability here is Banish. What Banish does is allow Limbo to target enemies, players, and objects and put them into the rift plane. This is basically used to make things invulnerable for a period of time, and the main use for Banish during the Eidolons is to prevent the lures from taking damage. However, I found this wasn't really necessary. Having a Warframe like Trinity around to heal lures when you need to, as well as upon casting Cataclysm, it's going to make them immune anyways. So manually casting Banish on them really isn't that beneficial. And if the lures are inside the Cataclysm when it deactivates, they're going to be taken out of the rift plane as well. Basically, trying to manage Banish constantly is a huge pain in the ass, and ultimately pretty unnecessary. Limbo's third ability here is not useful, and the passive has marginal use. Limbo's passive allows him to enter the rift plane on demand by pressing the dodge button. Again, most of the time you're going to be spending in the rift is going to be in the Cataclysm, so entering the rift plane like this probably won't happen very often for the Eidolons. But now that I've gone over Limbo's abilities, let's take a look at how I built him for the Eidolons. My Limbo build here is just about getting high range, good efficiency, and decent duration. Now, while for this video I am recommending running a higher duration build, I do think there's some good potential for a lower duration, where you would only need to cast Cataclysm once, and then simply let the duration run out. But because I was afraid of my team accidentally leaving the Rift plane too soon, I kept a higher duration build for this video. And a more experienced Limbo player, or a team that's used to a lower duration, could find it more beneficial to run that for the energy spikes. I just didn't feel confident enough when making this video to recommend that, but it is an option available to you. Now, if you want to run a lower duration build here, I'd probably run around 40 to 50 duration, which gives you roughly 10 seconds on your Cataclysm. And to accomplish that, I'd simply remove my Prime Continuity and replace it with a different mod. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm not super confident with the lower duration build, and I think it has a high potential for error, especially because the energy spikes seem to be bugged with Cataclysm. For this build, having strength doesn't matter. So to achieve a high range, I've gone for Stretch, Overextended, and Augur Reach. And because I'm running Fleeting Expertise here for efficiency, I have Prime Continuity to offset the lost duration. You definitely don't need 95%, but I would say, between like 80 to 90 is decent. There's definitely some wiggle room in the duration category. You just don't want your bubble to collapse too soon. I also like running Natural Talent on Limbo, because the casting animation can be quite slow, and this just helps you transition between casting Cataclysm and transferring back into your operator much smoother. And then as for my survivability, I just have Vitality. I'm also running Prime Flow here, but you can swap this out for another mod if you want to. I also want to give an honorable mention to Haven here, which is the augment for Banish. You can use this augment with Banish to heal the lures if you want to, but in an organized group, you probably won't need to because Trinity's going to be doing that already. If you're running Limbo solo, then that might be more beneficial, but that's another video. For today in this build, we're not going to be using Haven. And then as for my aura, my Exile slot here, I'm running Corrosive Projection with Coaction Drift. But you could also run other good auras like Enemy Radar or Deadeye if you want to. And then as for my Arcanes here, because Limbo's Cataclysm is going to be preventing the damage, as well as the magnetic procs from the energy spike phase, I'm running Guardian with Grace to increase my survivability outside of the Cataclysm. But you could really swap these out for whatever survivability Arcanes you want, even if you want to swap them out for Nullifiers. It's just up to whatever your preference is. But I hope that at least gives you guys an idea of why I built Limbo the way I built him. I'll quickly show off what else I'm using on him. I have a Lanka equipped, and a Sicarus. And I think in the footage you're about to see, I am running a Skoliak, but if you want to avoid losing Void Strike stacks when coming out of Arcwing, you could run no melee here, and that'll stop that from happening, which is probably a better build overall. But it's definitely not the biggest deal. And as for my pet, I'm running a Darzakavat with Cat's Eye. If you're playing Limbo, running a cat here is probably going to be more beneficial than another companion, simply because it has a chance to boost your DPS player's damage, and you're already giving up a good chunk of damage just to play Limbo. But now that I've gone over the build, let's look at some Limbo gameplay. Limbo is going to fill the same role that other frames like Harrow and Oberon do, which means you're going to be running Void Strike and taking down the Eidolon shields. So the way that I did this with Limbo is that as soon as my DPS player took down a limb, I cast Cataclysm, and then quickly transferred back to my operator to continue charging Void Strike. While the Cataclysm's up, the operators can still deal damage to the Eidolon, which means that the Unaru player can still clap and spawn wisps, and the operators can still shoot the Eidolon with their amps while the Cataclysm is up. However, the operators won't be able to pick up the Unaru wisps while they're in the Cataclysm. It's only upon deactivating Cataclysm that Unaru wisps are able to be picked up. This adds another layer of difficulty for operators dealing damage to the Eidolon shields. And it's another reason why your Cataclysm needs to be on point, because if you mess up the timing, which I definitely did a couple times, it's going to prevent the operators from dealing the extra 100% damage from the Unaru wisps. And remember, you're going to need to wait until all the energy spike waves have gone before deactivating your Cataclysm. It's because of all these factors that using Limbo's Cataclysm over something like Harrow's Covenant to prevent the magnetic procs and damage is like playing a hard mode for the Eidolons, and not in a good way. But apart from energy spike phases, you can also cast your Cataclysm at the end when the Eidolon goes down. This is really where Stasis comes into play, because it's going to freeze the Vonvolus and stop them from getting to the Eidolon and healing it. Although for the Terrorist, you really want to make sure you have at least 3 lures charged before activating Stasis, or at the very least, deactivate Stasis after a little while and make sure that at least 3 get charged. The other problem with using Cataclysm here is that it's going to prevent your DPS player from building combo on the downed Eidolon, which depending on their damage can be a real problem. But that's really something you should work out with your squad mates. Overall, like I said at the top of the video, Limbo technically works for the Eidolons and you can use him. He's just a much harder option than some of the other Warframes. But if you love Limbo and you want to play him during the Eidolon hunt, he is usable. But that's going to do it for this video on Limbo. If you found the video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like. And if you want to see more videos like this, subscribe for future content. But that's going to do it for me today, guys. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you later.